Now in this session we're going to look at an example of a high school U.S. history lesson dealing with the beginning of the war between the states, the bombardment of Fort Sumter, South Carolina. So first we'll look at what might be a traditional lecture type approach that you may have done in the past. Okay, so you have a handout that you give to the students, the student notes there, and on the left side I'll show you what I would write on the board during the lecture. So let's say that I'm lecturing. Okay, now, let's say Fort Sumter is an island fort located in Charleston Harbor in South Carolina. And so let's look at a map of South Carolina. Okay, here's a map of South Carolina, and we have Charleston Harbor down here, and you see Fort Sumter located here. Okay, so that's where we're talking about. Now, Fort Sumter is most famous for being the site of the first shots of the Civil War. After South Carolina voted to secede from the Union, we had U.S. Major, the leader of the United States forces, there was Major Anderson. And Major Anderson occupied that unfinished fort in December of 1860. And this caused a standoff with the state's militia forces. So when the new president, Abraham Lincoln, announced plans to resupply that fort, then the Confederate General Beauregard bombarded Fort Sumter. This was on April 12, 1861. So then there was a 34-hour exchange of artillery fire, and so on. So you continue on like this. You tell the story, and you write on the board the terms that the students need to fill in the blanks. Okay, now it comes test time. So you give a test which basically asks them to recall the facts you gave them for their notes handouts, something like this. Now, what do the students take away from this lesson? They probably don't remember the dynamics of the battle or even why it really happened. They might remember the location of the fort and maybe even the name of the Confederate general. The other things they probably just crammed during the period before the test and promptly forgot. Now, I think we can do better than that with a history lesson. So let's look at another way to teach that same lesson, a way that's going to get beyond these details to a better understanding of what happened at Fort Sumter. But first we need to think about the goal of our lesson. What do we want our students to take away from a lesson on Fort Sumter? Now, this might come from a set of standards the school follows, or it might just be your own belief in what's important here. But if you don't know what you want the students to learn from this lesson, you won't have any type of coherent lesson plan. And I think you should know by now that your goal should be more than students will remember the names of the commanders on both sides and the date the Confederacy began bombarding Fort Sumter. So for now, let's say that our goal for this lesson is that students will understand both the Union and the Confederate positions leading up to the bombardment of Fort Sumter, and will understand how this event led to the war between the states. To do this, we're going to take a practice that's done in advanced placement U.S. history courses, the document-based question, or DBQ. The idea here is that we present various original writings or other materials to the students and then teach them how to draw historical conclusions from them. Remember, we said we wanted our students to learn to think like historians, and this is what historians do. They study the artifacts of that time, whether those are writings, artwork, political cartoons, recordings, architecture, or whatever, and they draw conclusions from those artifacts. Now remember, we're not ignoring the facts of the incident, the names, dates, and places. Students need to know those details, even though we want them to go beyond them. Now, as an example of this, there's a website, and that you have the address for here, which has a good 2-class period lesson on this topic. And so we're going to look at that site and on a few others for an example of how we might do a DBQ on this same topic of Fort Sumter. Now, what you can do to have your students start investigating for themselves and finding out information, one thing you can do is go to this website. There's a lot of information here. There's even a lesson plan that's available here. But what we're going to do is look at some of the information. This first page here gives a summary, an overview of the situation at Fort Sumter. It also includes Fort Pickens off the coast of Florida. But this tells the students a bit about the background and what was going on at the time. So you could give the students this and just ask them to read it. You could ask them a few questions about it to key in on the main points. You might review some of the main points with them, but the thing is here, give them this background information. Okay? Then, one of the issues that came up was the debate within President Lincoln's cabinet. Lincoln had just been inaugurated as president before this happened, and so he's got his new cabinet, and so they are debating what to do about the situation at Fort Sumter. So, it's interesting that you can have your students read some of the debates. Here is the record of what Caleb Smith, one of the members of Lincoln's cabinet, what he said about it. And so here's his statement. And so you can have students read that. You also have this statement from another member of the cabinet, William Seward. So the students could read these two and they could contrast them. They could say, well, what did these different members of the cabinet, what did they believe? How did they argue? What did they think should be done? And why did they think it should be done that way? Okay, there's other websites as well, but you can have the students look these up. But see, they're reading the actual conversations that went on. Then, here is the correspondence that went on between Major Robert Anderson at Fort Sumter, the U.S. commander at Fort Sumter, and the Confederate commander, Brigadier General Beauregard, leading up to Fort Sumter's evacuation. And so you could have your students in small groups, have them read through these, and even make notes, make a timeline or make a summary. What happened at this time? What happened at this time? Based on these documents. Have them read them through. They're going to get down here to a point where here at April 12th, 1861 at 3:20 a.m., where the men who were under General Beauregard said, "We have the honor to notify you that he will open the fire of his batteries on Fort Sumter in 1 hour from this time." One thing you might point out to your students and have them notice, the respect and the civility that even took place in a time of war. I mean, here we have the honor to notify you. We have the honor to be very respectfully your obedient servants. As they read through it, they will see how the different sides made concessions to one another, how they said, "We're willing to give you assistance. You have fought bravely." I mean, a lot of stuff like that it's hard to imagine, but this is the way wars used to be fought. But your students are going to get a picture of that. They're going to see what it was really like by reading the actual correspondence. Then you could have a group of them go through this. This is General Beauregard's summary of the shelling of Fort Sumter and the evacuation of it. He gives his own record of what happened and explains why he did things. He tells us what went on. You have that one. You have some things going on down through here, but if you go down to April 27th, this one, here it gives the full detail, and he explains what happened. Now, obviously, this is from General Beauregard's point of view, but it's giving his perspective and his summary of the events. And again, this is something that I think is going to get the students more engaged in it, because all of a sudden it takes it out of the picture of being just some far-off war and you actually see one of the men involved writing down what happened, and it makes it a lot more interesting. It makes it a lot more real to the students. So you could divide the students up into several groups. You might have one group read one of these letters, another group read another one, or you could have each of them read them and talk about them together and come up with, okay, what are the main points here? But this is going to help them to understand it a whole lot better. And then you come back together and you can discuss, what did you learn? What did you find out from the cabinet discussions and so on? You have a discussion with your class on these issues. Then it's going to come time for the test. Instead of our test focusing on the names, dates, and places, have them think about questions like these. These will help you see if they really understand the issues involved. Again, remember, we're not interested so much that they know the exact date that Fort Sumter was bombarded, as that they understand what was going on. What were the big issues? What were the questions? What were the problems? Those are the things that we really want our students to take away from this. So, this is one example of a lesson. Now, the first year you do this, you're not going to be able to do it for every lesson in the course. Okay, so you want to think about, okay, when do you want your students to become more active and more engaged like this? But even when you do have just a traditional lecture, go back to the things we mentioned previously about interactive lectures, things like pausing every 10 minutes or so to allow them to compare notes, having them use Cornell notes, these types of things that we mentioned before. What you want to do is to get them thinking more about what you're teaching, and especially get them thinking on higher levels. So I hope this is helpful. I hope it's given you some ideas. Especially, I hope you're better able to use your own expertise and your knowledge of history to get your students better engaged in a study of history for themselves.